The Big Short, Adam McKay's 2015 black comedy on the 2008 financial crisis, opens with an aphorism attributed to Mark Twain. It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure that just ain't so. This quote perfectly summarizes one of the key paradoxes that occurs when people who are intelligent and genuinely interested in a subject can end up being less informed on it than total novices, not for a lack of effort on their part, but because by relying on faulty sources or not engaging with criticism, they end up forming false beliefs that make it so that despite legitimate work researching the issue, they are worse off than the person who knows nothing about it. This manifests most frequently among those who do their own research on scientific questions, or whose political ideology is little more than a collection of catchphrases gleaned from podcasts. But the phenomenon also rears its head in the study of history, even with episodes from the past that seem rather straightforward. Take, for example, Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon. Imagine, for just a moment, how this event unfolded. What is the image that forms in your head? Do you see Caesar, who, after a long period of self-reflection and final calculation, now strides across the river triumphant like a colossus on horseback, resolutely leading his legion as the first to enter Italy? If this is how you imagine the crossing having played out, then your image has been informed more by pop culture and art than the ancient sources. While I won't fault the drama of Caesar's crossing as depicted in HBO's Rome, for example, this is not how our sources tell us that it actually occurred. Rather than taking place in daylight on horseback, we know from Appian that he rode in a small carriage, and this naturally means that he crossed a bridge, a fact relayed to us by Suetonius. Further eroding the drama, we are told by Plutarch that he crossed at night under the cover of darkness. Not as iconic, to be sure, but for a commander hoping to move quickly and retain the element of surprise as long as possible, such a move was only natural. But perhaps the most damaging to our popular conception of the Rubicon crossing is the fact that Caesar wasn't even the first to cross the river into Italy. He had sent an advanced detachment in civilian dress ahead of his legion to seize the nearby town of Ariminum, so that his soldiers were able to find refuge there after their night march. Caesar not leading his army from the front detracts from how he is popularly perceived in this pivotal moment, but it also renders moot his supposed introspection on the banks of the river as he weighed the course of action. For if his troops had already entered Italy and seized a town, then he was already committed to war with the Pompeian faction. Perhaps when he quoted Menander to say that the die is cast, he was speaking in past tense, and with a bit of resignation. If it is this difficult to form a clear portrait of Caesar's actions, then naturally, understanding the reasoning that motivated him to cross the Rubicon should prove exponentially more difficult. For while we do have Caesar's own rationale preserved, we must remember that he was a consummate politician, and we are left to wonder if the reasons he put forward publicly were actually accurate reflections of his motivations, or whether he simply believed that this was the most compelling case he could make to the Roman people. As in all areas of historical study, but particularly true of the ancient world, the identification of mental processes and motivations must be handled carefully, especially when our subjects have displayed a knack for subterfuge. This is, of course, not to imply that history is unknowable. That would run counter to the critical realist approach that lies at the heart of this channel, but rather to state that we must act with caution, lest we end up knowing things that just ain't so. So in lieu of providing a comprehensive and definitive account of Caesar's mental processes that led to the crossing of the Rubicon, I today want to engage in some addition by subtraction, and remove from consideration one of the key reasons that is often put forward as a motivation for the decision to cross the Rubicon. I am talking about a theory that is advanced in popular history accounts to such a degree that it is taken as fact by many who engage with the material, informing our understanding of the event just as significantly as the art and film which have led us to think of Caesar crossing the Rubicon on horseback at the head of his army. I am speaking, of course, about Caesar's purported fear of prosecution and subsequent ruin by his arch-nemesis Cato, were he to return to Rome without an army at his back.
If you're enjoying this video, please do us a favor by liking, commenting, and subscribing. We're a small channel, and this is the only way to get the almighty YouTube algorithm to notice us. Furthermore, you can help Tribunate become more sustainable by becoming a member for as little as 99 cents a month. Thank you for all of your support.
The seemingly inevitable prosecution by Cato for Caesar's alleged misdeeds during his consulship of 59 alongside Bibulus often features in explanations of Caesar's decision to plunge the Republic into civil war. After all, the narrative implies that Caesar's career would be forfeit after being convicted, and thus he had nothing to lose. The idea is not without its merits, as it is based on a few key facts in the run-up to the crossing, most notably that Caesar did behave in a highly unconventional manner as consul, and that his enemy Cato had sworn an oath to personally prosecute the popularis general once the immunity he held as provincial governor expired. This desire to prosecute Caesar is often pointed at by those who hold that it was Cato's rationale for trying to force Caesar out of his governorship, and to make it impossible for him to declare his candidacy for a subsequent consulship without entering the city and thus becoming liable to prosecution. All the pieces seem to fit, at least at first glance. It was the tidiness of this narrative that led me to accept it for years, and even repeat elements of it in a previous video on the Rubicon crossing. However, my position has evolved, in no small part due to the groundbreaking work of Dr. Robert Morstein-Marx and his landmark biography, Julius Caesar and the Roman People. As he points out, the first flaw in the prosecution theory is that it is nowhere attested in the ancient sources. While this isn't always the definitive rubric which we should use in determining historicity, as many ancient sources have been lost, and sometimes those we possess simply do not address the relevant questions we are asking. But regarding the prosecution theory, the lack of attestation in our sources is particularly damaging, because we have not just a relative wealth of contemporary accounts, but authors like Cicero and Caesar himself who were intimately involved in the politics of Rome in the lead-up to the Civil War. Furthermore, though Cicero was lobbying tirelessly for a compromise, both these men ended up on opposite sides of the conflict, so we have a wider cross-section of sources than is typical for other ancient wars, where it is common for the testimony of the victors to provide the dominant narrative. In addition, attributing Caesar's actions to a fear of prosecution by Cato oversells the likelihood of the conviction and subsequent exile that would have destroyed Caesar politically. This is largely forgivable, though, because as moderns we tend to have faith in the judicial system acting impartially and convicting only the guilty, while exercising even more care in cases that are politically charged. This sentiment is unfortunately, however, a testament to the relatively elevated constitutional frameworks that guide modern states, and the significant progress that has been made since the ancient past in enshrining the rule of law. For the Roman judicial system lacked these fundamental principles, and the courts were not swayed by ironclad judicial reasoning, but more often by bribery, or when that failed to work, simple intimidation. Rome's courts were simply another stage for politics to play out, and little surprise that it was those who were the most politically connected and had the deepest pockets who emerged victorious. To us, Caesar's guilt in contravening constitutional precedent during his consulship is accepted almost universally as a given fact, and so we naturally believe that were Cato to fulfill his vow and bring Caesar to court, that the Roman jury would have also declared him guilty. We intuit that Caesar knew this as well, and thus sought to avoid a courtroom confrontation with his foes, opting instead to face them on the battlefield. But for the reasons I outlined above, there is simply no reason to believe that even if Cato had prosecuted Caesar, that the jury would have convicted. The tendency to view the civil war between the Pompeian and Caesarian factions as a conflict between Caesar and the Senate is more than just a gross oversimplification. It leaves the distinct impression that the lion's share of Rome's elite were united against Caesar, when in reality, even at the elite level, Caesar had many powerful allies, and could count on the support of scores of senators and equestrians. The outright anti-Caesar faction of Cato was a vocal minority. The bulk of senators were somewhere in the middle, something that is seen in the consistent votes to encourage the disarmament of Caesar and Pompey, not just Caesar alone. In addition, the Senate had only recently decreed that an unprecedented 55 days of public thanksgiving be celebrated in commemoration of Caesar's victory over the hated Gauls. This tremendous honor is not indicative of a body dominated by anti-Caesarian sentiments. Whether their loyalty had been earned through personal friendship or through the many interest-free loans that Caesar had offered from the plunder of Gaul, the fact is that many members of the elite were now firmly on his side and would not have backed any effort to convict him. What's more, after the death of Crassus, Caesar was now either the wealthiest man in Rome or a close second to Pompey. This meant that regardless of the composition of any potential jury, he had more than enough cash on hand to bribe those who were not already on his side. Yes, members of the conservative faction had deep pockets as well, but given Cato's resistance to bribery, it is an open question if they would have performed the necessary transactions required to sway the jury. But even if they had, Caesar would have been willing to outbid them, as it was his career on the line. The stakes were simply too high for him to risk getting outbid. But even if that had failed, Caesar had a trump card in the urban poor who he could rally to intimidate the jury, just as had happened when Cicero was cowed by a mob outside the court at the trial of Milo for the murder of the Populare organizer Clodius, and was too frightened to deliver his speech, resulting in his client's conviction. Caesar had contingencies for everything, and was not going to be outmaneuvered by Cato. Furthermore, though as stated the actual legal details would have been only of secondary concern, we must consider that the charges Cato sought to bring against Caesar were very weak and would not have been sufficient to turn public sentiment against him. The chief grounds for the prosecution is held to be Caesar's disrespect toward his consular colleague Bibulus, who called for voting to be halted due to the sighting of inauspicious signs from the heavens. Caesar had utterly disregarded this stalling tactic designed to prevent passage of his laws, and continued with business as usual. While this was a breach of precedent, Caesar was only responding in turn to Bibulus attempting to cynically leverage the gods in a bid to halt legislation. There is every reason to believe that the Roman people saw Bibulus's tactics for what they were, and felt no qualms about proceeding with the vote, as indicated by not just the passage of the law, but by the failure of certain attempts to overturn it over the next several years. For Cato to return to this slight a decade later would have seemed like sour grapes, and not enough to warrant the conviction of a man who had proved himself a popular hero, and had earned widespread acclaim for finally vanquishing the Gaulish menace. Rallying a broad coalition of elites to convict Caesar on these grounds would have proven nearly impossible. And this is not just mere conjecture on my part, because Cato's entire sense of urgency was predicated on his desire to deny Caesar a second consulship. Cato knew, just as everyone in Rome did, that Caesar's electoral triumph was a foregone conclusion. But this begs the question, If Caesar was popular enough to waltz to victory in his next consular election, how did Cato reasonably expect to convict him? We of course don't know, but perhaps Cato was simply displaying his trademark stubbornness and commitment to what he viewed as the rule of law by promising to prosecute Caesar even though he knew the effort would be futile. To a strict Stoic like Cato, the odds of success mattered less than doing what was right. The gesture meant more than the outcome. It is for these reasons that I feel that Caesar's supposed fear of prosecution can be taken off the table in the search for causes of the Civil War and the decision to cross the Rubicon. So, hopefully, by removing this false hypothesis, this video left you knowing less about the causes of the Civil War, but understanding more about the backdrop against which it took place. The study of history requires constant reevaluation and a willingness to question ideas, even popular ones, to gauge whether they still fit with emerging evidence. Now, for those of you that are still with me, I want to circle back to something I said at the beginning. As you may have noted, I was very careful with my words regarding the quote that Mackay attributed to Mark Twain. I had to be mindful of my language because, in a rather ironic turn, this quote about the importance of ensuring that the things we know are actually true cannot be traced back to Twain. Mackay evidently thought it came from him, but no one has been able to find it in Twain's writings, or even identify who originally coined the phrase. I have no doubt that had you stopped watching, you would have believed that the quote came from Twain, and in so doing, you would have known something that wasn't true. So, though I am coming clean about this little act of deception here, be aware that though this video was thoroughly researched, and I stand by the conclusions articulated here, I could have gotten something wrong. That's why it's critical to check the sources, which are listed in the description, and not take my word, or the word of any YouTuber for that matter, as authoritative. Because I would much rather you come away from my videos learning absolutely nothing than to know just one thing that ain't so.